here with Professor Christian uh, Busch, right? Is that how you say it? Or Bosch?
Busch is perfect.
Busch, perfect. So he is an expert in serendipity. And I just thought it'd be really fun to meet up with him. The sort of norms with this channel. I was just talking to him just before this. The norms with this channel is just to be as authentic and just treat this as we're just kind of hanging out, rather than some sort of interview or anything like that. So I just want to make sure that we're all aware that we're just having fun here and horsing around. It's not really all that serious, anyways. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we can jump into that. Christian, what's your thoughts and sort of feeling? What is this sort of serendipity thing, and then how do we actually get into serendipity? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Dave. It's wonderful to catch up with you. And serendipity, it's something, it has played a huge role in my own life, and then I've seen it pop up in my research as well. And so I got extremely interested in the kind of dynamics behind it. And what we've seen in our work is this kind of interesting difference between blind luck, which is all the things we can't really choose, right? Birth lottery, all these kind of things that create a lot of societal inequality. And then there's this active luck that serendipity is about, where, take the situation, you're in a coffee shop and you accidentally spill coffee over someone next to you. And that person looks at you slightly annoyedly, but you sense there might be something there. You don't know what it is. You just have a sense. And now you have a couple of options, right? One option is you just say, I'm so sorry. You walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken to that person? Option two, you speak with that person and it becomes the love of your life or your next research partner or co-founder, or you name it. The point is how we react to the unexpected, that interaction between randomness and our own actions. That's really what creates that kind of beautiful serendipity that we talk about.
Yeah, it seems really interesting. I was kind of poking around and seeing some of the stuff that you've written about this, and it seems that explains a bit of your own story in terms of what happened. I'm not sure if you want to give any background on how you arrived upon this idea of serendipity in the first place. It seems really, to be honest, from somebody that studies strategy and entrepreneurship and all that kind of stuff. From my perspective, it seems weird, right? Like it is kind of off center from what everybody else is doing. Most people are sort of saying that you have to have this plan, and then you execute on this sort of very simple plan, and everything works out for you. And that's how we actually make a whole bunch of money. We become rich and all of that kind of stuff. So maybe if you can explain what happened in your life in terms of arriving upon the idea of serendipity, I think that would be interesting for everybody.
No, it's a great question. My whole life feels like a amalgamation of coincidences and things that somehow then became serendipitous. But I have an entrepreneurial background, and so a lot of the kind of projects that I helped start and there was part of would be either serendipitous. You meet your co-founder in the queue of a coffee shop, and then you get talking, and you're like, oh my God, we have something in common here, or other kind of things. Same in my love life. But then what I found fascinating is later on in my research that the most successful, inspiring people, they seem to have something in common, right? They would all, in board meetings and things, they would talk about planning and all these, exactly those kind of important things that you just mentioned. But then when you would talk with them kind of, and go deeper and deeper and deeper, they would say things like, yeah, I had this plan, and then I spoke with Hilda, and Hilda told me this and this, and then we adjusted the plan, and now it's a much better plan. But this is a story that, like, my board wants to hear. I planned this, then I did this, and then exactly that happened. And so kind of I want to tell the planning story. And so what I found fascinating is that there seemed to be this mismatch between what we think the kind of official story is and how people officially talk about it, and then how emergent it actually is, right? And that goes back to Henry Mintzberg and all those kind of things, that at the end of the day, strategy a lot of times is emergent. But what I found fascinating is that in a way, what we try to figure out is there a way that combines the idea of planning with the idea of emergence? So you're neither planning and have everything under control, nor it's all emergent and you can't control it. And so that's really the idea of cultivating serendipity, this idea that, hey, can you create the conditions that make it more likely that you encounter interesting, positive, good things, but then also do something with it, but then make it part of your plan? To give you an example, if you're Ajay Banga at MasterCard, the previous CEO of MasterCard, he would say something like, I want to get 500 million people who were previously unbanked into the financial system. That's our North Star. That's our sense of direction. That's where we want to go. Here's the strategy. We start here, then we go here. But I'm telling you already now that when Hilda in Cape Town tells us that the story doesn't work with her, the narrative or the strategy doesn't work with her, we'll adjust it. And that is part of our plan. And I think that kind of giving the license to build the unexpected into the planning, we're very curious about what are ways to do that. And even simple things in weekly meetings, right? What surprised you last week? If you ask that simple question, people start looking out for the unexpected. And that's where a lot of really interesting new ideas and things come from.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So you're getting at something that's probably even more profound and deeper than just serendipity. I was thinking, we have this sort of hypothesis testing mentality baked into science where we have to have this sort of hypothesis up front, and then we test this particular hypothesis. And often, almost always, right, we never find the results that we were expecting. And one route, and this is the route that I took when I was doing my PhD, was, by the way, the whole reciprocity project is kind of geared towards the way that I sort of imagine it is giving hope to researchers around the world. Because it's kind of like this really scary process, right? I mean, we can't figure things out, and there's often not a lot of people out there that are sort of being helpful, or you might be in an institution where it just doesn't have that. So yeah, we do this kind of hypothesis testing. We get these results that are either null results, they are not present, or there's something that's completely different. And our default that we're programmed in as researchers and scientists, is that we assume that we did something wrong. How do we get around that? And how do we sort of say, hey, wait a minute, maybe this wasn't wrong. Maybe this is the way it should have been, should have turned out. What's your thought? Like, how do you actually deal with that? How did you arrive upon, instead of assuming serendipity is something that's problematic, how do you actually jump on this?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm a huge fan of whenever diving into a new topic to really first have conversations with people and really first try to understand what is really happening there. Not only what is the literature telling us about something, but actually let's talk to people who do it every day and then try to figure out what they're doing, and then from there on build our hypothesis and test them. And so it's kind of when you look at qualitative research, right? So research that you're doing kind of more based on interviews, observations, and things like that. A lot of times you have serendipity in-baked, right? Because essentially what you're saying is you're going out there with a certain idea of something, some sort of hunch, and then people tell you about something that is really counterintuitive, and you're like, wow, this is surprising. Let me dive deeper into this. And so what I find always like really useful and helpful is to think about not I think there's a lot of conversation always, am I a quant researcher or a qual researcher or this or that? And you know what I mean? Like, well, the method should follow, what you're most intrigued about, and the kind of what you're most intrigued about. A lot of times, part of it might come from the literature, but part of it also really comes from understanding the phenomenon because you're in it. You talk with people, and so I'm a really big fan. First, talking with people and just kind of like listening in, like what is it that I wouldn't have expected? What doesn't really resonate with what I've read? And I feel that's where the interesting tension comes from. Then that also, when you look at the last years, right? I feel there's been a bit of a shift away from only thinking about theoretical gaps and like what is the kind of idea of what's the gap in the literature to no, what's the tension here between what the literature says and what reality is, or even what's an empirical puzzle here that I don't understand and that I can
Mhm.
dive into. And I think the way to get to that is just literally open mind, beginner's mind, right? Get into a context and saying, let me just ask all these like basic questions first, but they might really illuminate a little bit more about this. And that was the same with this, like with the serendipity piece. It was really something where when you hear people speak, so when you hear someone like Ajay Banga, right, who would say, I did this and then unexpectedly this happened. And then in his mind, first it would be something like, oh, this is passive, right? That something unexpected happened. But then when you feed it back and you're sense making together and you're saying, no, what you're actually doing is you're cultivating serendipity, then it's like, wow, yes, true. Here's a language for what I've been doing that I didn't have before. And I think that's the beauty of what we can do as researchers. We can also be part of sense making, and that's kind of I think then one of the most beautiful things, to me at least, where you feel, hey, I can also have an impact on that practitioner side.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about that because you've been actively constructing this sort of paradigm, I guess, and doing different in the Academy of Management, for example. You organize this really amazing symposium or panel with different people talking about it. Who would have? I was looking at the panel. I was like, many of these people probably established the norms of understanding the world. Of, hey, this is the sort of normal way of doing decision making. We should sort of set these things out, these processes out. But you know, you're almost at the forefront of saying, wait a minute, maybe we need a language of putting in more randomness, more disorder within the process. So that's interesting that you've kind of built in this community building aspect into what you're actually doing. Why have you chosen to do that? That seems from a perspective of how we so a lot of the stuff you probably have. I don't know if you've seen me online. I really push back on the norms of how we should do things and sort of try to give people a little bit of like gumption that we could do things that are a little bit unusual, and sometimes it's really good. Sometimes you discover really cool things. So what has been your journey with coming towards this sort of community building aspect of research in academia?
The you know I found it intriguing when you think about what makes an interesting academic conversation. It's, of course, that we stand on the shoulder of some kind of giant that says, here's a certain assumption in the first place, and then what do we do with this assumption? And so what I found really interesting is that I think there is this kind of community of people who are working on serendipity, and I think that's a wonderful emerging community where essentially we're building on each other's work and we're developing that work. And that's almost like where we preach to the choir, right? Because we've seen the similar things. We know that serendipity is an important kind of thing that has always been treated as variance and error factor and all these kind of things, but actually it's much more important than that. And so I think there is this community of people who intuitively know that what we're doing is kind of brings us together because we've seen it in practice, and now we feel, hey, this should have a role in theory as well. But then I think there's exactly that kind of let's say kind of more established approaches and theories where it just feels, hey, you have so much to say about this. And we really want to avoid reinventing the wheel. And we really want to avoid to somehow position these questions as they are the opposite of X, Y, Z. No, they are not. They're just really kind of saying, instead of seeing a friction here that's just a dichotomy, we're seeing a paradox that you can potentially resolve by thinking about it in a more dynamic way. And I think that was kind of that symposium that you mentioned was really thought to be that, to say, okay, let's take a couple of people who are deep in strategy, some people who are deep in innovation, who might have followed a certain approach. And then now it's a great opportunity to also say which of our assumptions 100% hold versus which of those 80% hold. And if they hold 80%, can we do something together to then kind of bring that to the next level? And so really kind of standing on their shoulders to develop that new thing versus saying we develop it independently, but then actually it's reinventing too many fields. And Ranjay Gulati said it beautifully. I think this idea that everyone tried to give luck a chance, and I love that kind of idea of people gave luck a chance because, as you know, right, a lot of people have written about luck and serendipity as like, oh, we shouldn't even study it because what is there that is managerially relevant? Like there was like one quote was, I think, along the lines of, shall I teach my managers to be luckier? Well, yes, maybe there is actually ways that we can do that. And so that's kind of the interesting thing. I think that we're questioning some of those assumptions, but also saying we don't want to position that as opposite to something. We really want to position that as part of a bigger conversation around that strategy can be both emergent and planned, and that isn't saying one literature is wrong and the other one's right. It's more saying you both have amazing assumptions in parts, and then some parts we can maybe kind of complement here and build on that.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about have you been able to get people to buy in or practice some of this stuff? And what does it actually look like when they practice more serendipity or being in, just being in the moment, I guess, is what you're somewhat suggesting, right? Of sort of seeing that, hey, wait a minute, we could take a step back, and what we're pursuing is not right or wrong, but there might be some opportunities if we sort of go in this different direction that we wouldn't have assumed that was the right way to do it.
Well, and the interesting thing to your point is, I think that there is so much work that can be done, around how do you actually then, in that particular theme, like how do you cultivate serendipity? If you think about it from when you build on existing theories, right? So there's some recent work, for example, around quantum approaches to management, which I find mind blowing because it's essentially the idea of, you have all this potentiality out there, all these potential things that could happen, right? So in this coffee shop example, when you spill that coffee, there's all these potential things that can happen, but you only realize one of these things. So only
Mhm.
one thing actually happens, and then it opens up all this new potentiality. And so I think if you use those different types of approaches that allow you to capture something that previously maybe you didn't want to capture too much because it seems like, it's easier to just count, things, and versus like maybe think about it in a sense that there might be categories that can change, and you can think about the potentiality of those categories, and things like that. So long story short, I think where we can learn a lot from practice is that in practice we've seen a lot of those kind of approaches that increase potentiality, right? So to give you an example, if you take the hook strategy, right? So imagine, David, you're going to AOM, right? So the AOM conference, and you go to these kind of networking sessions, and someone asks you, "So, David, what do you do?" You could now say, "Oh, I'm David. I'm working on this amazing reciprocity topic or podcast, and that's what I'm doing." Right? So that's one thing that kind of you give them one potential dot. But if you were to say, I'm researching on XYZ, I'm really excited about this podcast, but what I'm really interested in is kind of, bringing my 2-year-old daughter up at the moment. What you're doing here is you're giving them 3 potential dots, more potentiality, where they could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. We also just had a daughter. Let's talk. Such a coincidence. We also just worked on XYZ thing. And so it's really this idea where you can see in those kind of almost natural experiments in some way or the other, how people can increase that potentiality space by literally offering a little bit more to people in terms of information, in terms of potential points and things like that. And so I think it's almost then, to ask the challenge always then is, okay, how do you measure these kind of things when you want to understand how that works out in a particular setting, and then you take them to other settings. But I think that's the next 20 years of research, I think, right there for everyone who's listening. I hope a lot of people will do their PhDs on related topics. And David, by the way, this was like really the idea also of this symposium, where we said, right, hey, look, let's bring together people like Henry Mintzberg and others who really have shaped the field of strategy and management, and in a way legitimize a little bit that serendipity is a field, or at least a phenomenon, that's really worthy to be studied, because it's something that doesn't, that is fresh enough so that you can really get a few new ideas that relate to existing topics, but at the same time also it's de-risked because
Yeah.
maybe some of the interesting people talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is such a big part of it, is figuring out how to de-risk things. I mean, for me, and yeah, I've been in the field for a while now. I still get very nervous and anxious when I talk to people, and that's part of the reason why I probably do like one word answers, like you're suggesting, right? Like I'm not going to go into too much detail. And so the notion of making people feel okay with something, okay with a certain idea. I mean, I've seen this with qualitative work right now, where at one point it was like, I don't know if you should do it, but I think most people are okay with doing qualitative work now. The same thing with field experiments. Same thing with replicating research, right? Like that was considered like, why are you replicating research? That's kind of a stupid idea. We already know that, right? Until we discovered, hey, wait a minute, this stuff is, when we replicate things, we find out that there's interesting things that are going on. So partly the de-risking of things, I think, is a super important part. And I think having this notion of, and I really love the idea that Amy Edmondson sort of talks about, the psychological safety and feeling okay to say things, not necessarily like anything, right? Like shocking things that we see in sort of day-to-day life now, that seem to go viral, but just like being okay with being who you are, I think is an important part of a researcher, an important part of doing the things that we actually do. Um, so how did you actually get to how did you become a researcher yourself? So I was looking up a bit on your bio, and it didn't seem like that was the original course that you were intended on, but I'm not sure. I don't know if you want to talk about that so everybody else understands how we actually become the thing that we become. Go and become a scholar.
Yeah. No, it's been an intense search for meaning for a long time. I had an experience early on in life that made me realize how quickly life can be over, and since then I've been trying to figure out what gives me a lot of meaning, and I derive a lot of meaning
So
from.
what
Yeah.
was this experience? I think that this is probably important to share and talk about.
Yeah. Well, it was a car crash. So in juvenile hyper bullyish type, I crashed into four parked cars, all cars completely kaput, mine too, and it was this kind of moment of complete powerlessness, like when the car was you know um, not controllable anymore, and that was kind of extremely scary. You realize I realized how fragile life is, how quickly life can literally just be gone and over. And that was a period where I asked myself a lot of these kind of questions around, you know, why am I here? What is this all about? Would I have messed up my family's life? Would I have messed up, So it was a lot of kind of deep questions. And I read this amazing book, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which
Yeah.
is all about, how do we find meaning in especially tougher situations. And I think what I've kind of been sense making ever since was that what gives me a lot of meaning is really connecting ideas, connecting people with each other. So I started out as community builder and entrepreneur and kind of trying to do those connections. And then, at some point it felt a little bit that a lot of the things we were doing was really reinventing the wheel, and was kind of like, okay, great, like this seems to have been there already. And in a way, when there's this intellectual curiosity, I kind of felt, okay, I want to learn more, I want to know more about all these things we're doing here, and really kind of build a little bit more on that. And so the PhD was literally kind of out of a conversation then of someone. I did my master's, and someone was like, hey Christian, have you ever considered doing that PhD literally out of this, like what you're doing, like out of your entrepreneurial things that could be a PhD. And so that was the conversation, and out of that conversation, then kind of I ended up doing a PhD that was slightly different than I thought it would look like.
So tell us about this. No, this is good. No. That's what I want to sort of get on, is to tell everybody's story. That it's always different. It's always unique.
Yeah, I mean, the initial PhD was really the idea of let's study the organization that we were building, which a community of young innovators, and helping them make the ideas happen. And so diving into that, and then at some point I realized, okay, maybe that is not necessarily the most interesting context for actually really understanding. At that point, it was more about meaning. How do you create meaning? How do you create impact? How do you create ventures that have more impact? Things like that. And so again, a couple of conversations led then more into context of poverty and context of where people don't have a lot of networks to start out with, and a lot of resources. And so then there was a kind of whole journey of which now finally some of the papers, like, it sounds incredible for those of you who do quant, but when you do a qual paper, some of the papers that we started back then in 2009 2010 now are being published. So it's kind of like it's literally it was a 15-year journey. I mean, the data collection, analysis, but then also review processes and all these different types of things. And so they're only now coming out. But what I found fascinating is that it's almost, we started out more with kind of what makes impact, what creates that kind of really interesting networks that can create an impact, and so on. But then serendipity popped up more and more, literally everywhere. And so that was, in a way, the thing that I felt I was most interested in then to see, hey, my personal life that seemed to be a lot about serendipity, I can see that in my research too. And so there was almost a homecoming then of saying, wow, like, thank you for actually leading me back to what I seem to be most excited about, which is that kind of, making meaning in context and serendipity in a way.
Yeah. So for those of you, so first I didn't want to interrupt you. That
Mm-hmm.
so Viktor Frankl was, I believe, a psychologist that survived concentration camps. Am I right? And I believe that's the scenario. And he was trying to figure out, like, how was it that some people still had an sort of, they kind of thrived in those moments when everybody else is going through despair. In talking about some of the more softer stuff in our lives is a really important part. I think I always, and this is one of the more challenging things that we deal with, is that um, that particularly with like a PhD is so much of like discovery. And I was thinking about this as you were talking about it. Like, there had to have been moments where, I mean, how did you come up with the idea of serendipity itself? Right? Like, it's very difficult to come up with a construct or a name. um, and I often struggle with that all the time. And I don't know what it is that sort of drives those things. So I'm kind of curious to see how you develop this idea.
It was, I was bombarded from different sides with it, and first when you think, oh, this is a bit of a concept that is too far away from what you can do research on, which in my case, I had people around me saying, hey, look, Christian, don't work on this. Like, this is kind of quote unquote academic suicide, right? Like to
Yeah.
work on those kind of topics. And to my delight, though, it just kept popping up and popping up, and at some point I just couldn't say no anymore. And so it was kind of, because in my entrepreneurial life, the community that we set up back in 2007 2008, that was a community that was essentially, we called it a serendipity accelerator. So like in our own life we were all about serendipity, but again, in the research it was more about, that's not a topic I can really study, so let me study more about meaning and networks and impact and things like that. But then over time, it's just you speak with really interesting leaders, and they would always kind of come back to this idea of, hey, look, like, unexpected this, and then I did this. And so after time, then it was just, the even if people didn't use the term for it, it would be, the underlying idea would be that there was just serendipity everywhere, especially in poverty contexts. And so I found that extremely fascinating, that the one organization that I've been working with now for over 10 years in one context in South Africa, they out of necessity cultivate serendipity all the time, because they don't have a choice. Like, that's the only way to survive, that you somehow create your own luck locally. And so I became extremely fascinated by this. So again, if you see that the CEO of MasterCard has very similar kind of patterns as the social entrepreneur somewhere in the Cape Flats in Cape Town to oneself, then like there's so many patterns at some point where, like, I just can't ignore those patterns anymore. I got to dive deeper into those patterns as well.
Yeah. So two things that I was thinking when you're doing this. The first one was, it's like, as soon as somebody says don't do that, that's usually like, oh my gosh, that is the route that you should be going in, right? Like, almost every single time. That means that the sort of field is going this way. It's kind of boring, and then there's like something that you want to pursue. And then the other thing is, um, it's very, so I think if I was thinking as somebody, maybe it's an MBA or maybe an undergrad student, and they're looking at this and they're saying, "Hey, wait a minute! Like, somebody that is in, um, you know, some village in South Africa, they're going to have absolutely no relations. They're not going to be very similar to people that are, maybe the CEO of Mastercard. Like, how do you draw the connections between human beings in those particular scenarios?
Well, it's fascinating, right? So this one study that we did with that organization, where serendipity popped up all the time. One of the key patterns that came out of that was, they're extremely good at reframing situations, right? So they look at a particular situation, and then they say, okay, is there still something in here? Is there still an opportunity in here? If Let me give you an example with COVID. when COVID happened, they are an organization that delivers low-cost education to people. So it's things like 10 steps to use social media to build a business, things like that. And they're embedded in a kind of really tough community where high crime rates, high unemployment rates. So it's a community where people usually don't get access to education that much. And so it's really kind of the one way for people to get a little bit of access to education. And so they essentially, offered that in person. So people would come to their centers and then they would offer that in person. When COVID happened, that unexpected event, they were like, oh, okay, you know what? Maybe we can use WhatsApp and kind of related things that people have here to deliver nano courses. And those nano courses now, actually, they're also selling to companies as a product. And so what happened is they out of necessity have those kind of things where the unexpected happens all the time. And then they connect the dots frequently where they're like, oh, maybe we can still see something in this and do something with it and then turn that into something that actually now looking back for them becomes a key business model part also. And so that is the same you see with a CEO at MasterCard who would be really good at saying, you know what, there's a crisis, but let's not waste that crisis. Let's do something with it. First. Second, I think there's a lot of this kind of really interesting especially in that context that people are so used to the unexpected, but at the same time, they want to plan as much as they can. And so this kind of balance between somehow planning, but also then constant openness to the unexpected, good or bad. And that's, again, the same with really smart CEOs who are really good at saying, hey, I can't give you certainty, but I can give you clarity. And I think that's kind of the really like smart thing that a lot of them figured out. And the third thing, I think, something that has always struck me, and with any people, any person I've met around the world, the level of curiosity, I think, with like extremely interesting, inspiring, purposeful, high impact leaders are extremely curious. They ask why all the time. And that's kind of the same, the social entrepreneur in Nairobi that we worked with, the social entrepreneur in Cape Town, to the CEO of whatever company, that they're just asking why a lot. And I think that kind of, approach to just, hey, I don't assume I have it all figured out. You know what? I'll figure it out together here with you. And so I think that's kind of a pattern as well that we've seen.
Yeah, how do we train people? How do we get people to ask why more often? What is it? Like I really struggle with this because I mean, first of all, I would love to get my kids to be curious. By the way, one of them is probably just about to come in from school, but just to be more like curious in the world. But I also want to figure out, how do I connect? One of the things I really struggle with as as a professor, and particularly teaching undergraduate students, because I think that there's a bit of an age gap. But how do I connect with them so that they are just curious about the world? Um, that and what do we do in this circumstance?
I've always been a big fan of Ken Robinson, who unfortunately recently died, but he was this brilliant mind to research a lot around creativity. And he had this story, right? I'm just paraphrasing, but essentially it was along the lines of, there was this kid in high school, and teachers were like, oh my god, she's always kind of like hibbling around and like she's never really focused and everything else. And so one day he's like, okay, let me invite the parents, let me put the kid alone in a room, and I'll just put some music and see what happens. And so they stand outside, the kid doesn't see them, kid sits inside, he just puts some music and sees what the kid does, and the kid starts dancing. And he says to the parents, you know what, your kid is a dancer. Your kid, like, if we put her too much into the math sections here and all this kind of stuff that in a way doesn't connect with her inner world too much in that sense, and it kind of really, it maybe he would always use that idea of it we educate her out of creativity. And so it's really kind of this idea that I think we might go into a session and think, oh, there's the one content we want to teach and the one thing that then we test in the exam and they should all know. But the one way that I found to be extremely effective is, once people get curious about something because they genuinely care about it, because it relates to their own life. So to give you an example, that organization that I just mentioned, what they're really good at is to say, instead of using these examples like, Peter came to school and he has 2 apples, and here are 2 more apples, like now Peter has 4 apples, what they would say, the kids in their vicinity would say, we don't have anyone like who is called Peter in this vicinity. Like everyone here is called different than Peter. Like Peter is like such a kind of like, US kind of type like name. So
Yeah, yeah.
first like change, like, like make it our lived reality, make it like, what we really experience every day, and then relate it to somehow that something that we're really curious about. And I've seen that in my own sessions, whenever I use these kind of like high level examples of like big CEO this, big CEO this, it's just very far away from people, versus if it's kind of like, hey, look, this is the local like subway owner, here he is, and you're gonna work with them anyways over the summer because you need to make some money on the side. Like this is how they think about this, and then they kind of like get really curious about, oh wow, yeah, like what could we do, and learn about it. So not being too far away from the kind of examples we use, but also then really kind of having something that they care about. It's like in our own lives, no, we want to care about something versus but I guess nobody has really figured it completely out, right? That's our journey of learning to figure.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, that's why I've been so somewhat personal with everything that I do, particularly online that you see, right? Like I try to be as personal as possible, is because like, um, there's got to be somebody else that feels the same way as I do, or there's got to be somebody else that's resonating. And if I start talking about, and I actually learned that through doing this. So if you don't know the whole story with the Reciprocity Project, actually, so I put out this. My second year or third year of assistant professor here at the institution that I'm at. I'm not going to disclose it, but most people would recognize it. Um, I wanted to get some editing done on my work, and I couldn't get editing done because I couldn't afford it. And I was like, well, I teach entrepreneurship, I teach innovation, I could build this thing. So I go and try to put this thing together. And what I realized along the way was, hey, it's one thing to build the product. So I built the product, put it online. Nobody paid attention to it. Nobody cares, right? So I talked to somebody, and they were somebody that was kind of in the software industry. They're like, "Can you do YouTube videos about it?" So I started doing YouTube videos, and if it was like kind of instructional and about the particular thing, nobody cared, right? But as soon as I started talking more about the personal experiences and the challenges that we face, like sometimes it's a little difficult to be a researcher or an academic or a graduate student, or just doing life in general, balancing parenting when you have a high demand career. um, it's often very difficult, right? And then figuring out and sort of telling, hey, this is how I basically deal with it. And a lot of it is just like, hey, just to disregard as much as I possibly can, which is like advice that was given to me by my one of my sort of mentors a long time ago. And he was reading, there was a book about, he's a physicist that was out in California. I can't remember the guy's name now. He's really well known. But that was the way that he coped with things, was just like disregard the rest of the world and figure out how you could just kind of live your thing and be as normal and functional as possible. So I mean, I'm greatly what you're suggesting with the sort of serendipity, the idea of personal connection, the idea of that you need to just be there somehow. I truly resonate with what you're saying. I think it's it's a great research project that you're working on.
Well, and thank you. And I think, you're a great example, I think, of, look, AI is coming, right? So we have enough machines and robots, so we might as well be human, right? Like in terms of like,
Mhm.
and that we have it all figured out. And I think that's kind of the thing where, when you think about how do we connect with people, why do we connect with people? Because there's something that's worth connecting about, right? And usually that's, content is all nice and stuff, but like we probably have very similar challenges. We have, we go through identity crises, especially as researchers, right? Like we probably have them more frequently than other people, that there's this, oh my god, like, what is this all about? And so why wouldn't we talk about it? And I think this is kind of, I found that always really interesting with Pixar, for example. I felt they did that differentiation really nicely between perfection and excellence. That the core point was always like, if you try to always be perfect, like then you shoot yourself in the leg, because you're constantly under stress. You will never be kind of your most creative. But if you strive for excellence, so that your outcome should be excellence, right? You want to have an A paper or whatever it is, but then the process itself is messy. The process itself will not be perfect, and that's okay, right? We kind of avoid whatever avoidable mistakes we can avoid, but also we learn from the things that didn't work. And I think, I see that a lot in organizations where people always love to talk about the things that do work, right? So successes, but we can obviously learn much more from the things that didn't work. And so building a culture that allows people to talk about the things that didn't work in a way that doesn't feel like, okay, now tomorrow you can step them in the back because now they opened their heart too much, right? And
Yeah.
I think that comes back to your earlier point about psychological safety and how we, in a way, can do the Brené Brown kind of vulnerability without oversharing. So this kind of, okay, yes, I want to connect with you on a deep level. Of course, I don't want to throw all my problems at you at the same time and kind of overwhelm you with it. But at the same time, look, we're both humans, and we both want to connect over things we really care about versus talk for 20 minutes about the weather, right? And I think that's kind of, in a way, why I'm such a big fan of these like simple practices of asking questions differently. Instead of asking what do you do, asking what brings you here or what do you enjoy doing. It's like very small shifts in how we ask questions, but what it does is it opens up the opportunity space, getting away from boxing people into positions, into roles, into one yes or no question to no, I'll let you go wherever you want to go. If I ask you what brings you here, you can say, oh, what brings me here is my daughter who brought me here. Or you can be like, I'm on a journey towards meaning and like I'm trying to figure it all out, and I'm here now because my daughter pulled me here. But my point is, you can answer those questions on whatever level you want. And I think that's kind of, I've always loved these questions where you allow the other person to choose whatever they feel most comfortable with, where they want to go, versus what do you do, and then putting people into boxes and things.
Yeah, that's super cool. So I have probably a pointed question, but we probably should get going fairly soon. I don't want to keep you too long. So I'm another 10 minutes or so.
Mhm.
Is that okay? So have you found meaning? And what does that look like? Do you think that you have more meaning today than you do 10 years ago?
It's really coming back to Viktor Frankl. I think that I've been fascinated by his kind of between the lines kind of idea of duality of meaning, in a way that this idea of when he was in the toughest situation you can imagine, concentration camp, where no hope, like you essentially, like, objectively there's no meaning, but then he proactively created meaning for himself, right? He said, okay, I still want to write this book once I get out of here, so that is kind of my big purpose, my big meaning, my big thing out there that I strive for, my stretch goal, in a way. And then, hey, there's so many people here who I can help feel make better by just speaking with them. And so, hey, I want to speak with all these people. So every day now I still have a person I need to speak with. So I have a reason to wake up tomorrow morning. So I have some sort of micro meaning here as well. And so I've always been inspired by this idea of, can you build that duality into your life, where I feel I have a lot of micro meaning at the moment, where, there's micro tasks in my days that feel very meaningful, writing a bit, kind of related to the book and things like that. And then there's kind of the bigger thing, which is, hey, look, this book, that brings together all the research I've been doing. I feel the next 10 years I want to spend even more time on how do we get that into more curricula, how do we get that into more organizations. And so that, in a way, is kind of my broader theme. And then the reason why life feels even more meaningful now, though, than 10 years ago is certainly my daughter and my wife, who add this additional layer that I didn't even know existed. Because I think when you're so, when you're very passion and purpose driven, like, I think I certainly missed out on that kind of whole idea of, what, there's also like the things that really ground you and that anchor you and that actually build that additional layer that is just so much more meaningful in terms of joy. And so that is the most joyful thing now, right? I mean, those of you who have family, how there's nothing more joyful than see your kids smile at you, right? You know that probably, David, from your own life. It's just, it adds a layer that you can't get, I think, from other things in life. And so from that perspective, it feels more meaningful now. But in general, I think it's more the journey. It's more the, like, I stopped aiming for things that, like, to get them, to reach them, right? So I'm still very excited, right? Like, yes, this paper is published or this qualification is achieved and things like this. But I've realized, right, as soon as you achieve it, like, then the next one comes and the next one comes. So aiming for a particular goal and then attaching too much to that goal, a lot of times might not lead to the kind of real satisfaction versus the kind of journey itself. Like, do I enjoy working towards that? And to me comes back to our initial point of the conversation. Like if you're in academia because you kind of you want a stable job and you somehow want tenure and things like that, I think that's gonna make it tough, because you, in a way, it's really the process. When you look back in 20 years and you're saying, did I actually live life? Like you want to say yes, like I worked on something that felt meaningful, and so that's kind of, I think, coming back to our conversation, like what feels truly meaningful, and even if people say that it doesn't make a lot of sense to
Yeah,
them, they might
yeah.
still be there.
Yeah, and then so there's two things I was thinking about. The first one is writing a book is in at least in our genre of academia is considered like I don't know if you should be spending your time and effort doing that. You should be doing writing papers, right? Research papers, because that's what sort of pays off in the long run. But why? So first of all, why write a book versus doing more research papers? And by the way, kudos to you. That takes a lot of courage, given the sort of culture that we have with this. And it truly is an amazing thing that you did. It's very very difficult. Most people don't realize how difficult it is to sort of stand up and say, hey, I'm just going to do this because I think it's actually the thing for me. And then the other thing that I think about in terms of meaning, right? So, as you were talking, and I was thinking about a young kid, and at least with my kids, when they were younger, 3 or 4 years old, they would stop and stare at a mud puddle. And they would just look at everything that's in that mud puddle. And most people would sort of walk past that mud puddle and they wouldn't say, it would just look like a mud puddle. It's dirty and whatnot. But to somebody at that age, it's got all sorts of amazing things. And then I actually study is to look at mud puddles. We overlook them all the time, but think about all of the chemistry, think about all of the amazing things that are going on. And it's such an inspiring thing to actually look at mud puddles, but everybody else is going to be like, to heck with mud puddles, right? So I just think it's really cool. It depends on how you define what your meaning is and what you're actually about. I think it's a lot of it is thinking, what's going on, like inside of you, in some degree. So I don't know if you wanted to share about your idea to write a book. So for those of you who will watch this. And by the way that YouTube works, if you didn't know, it's like not too many people will watch this now, but over the course of many, many years, lots of people watch this. So Christian wrote a book called The Serendipity Mindset. And, the gist of it is serendipity matters. And in our field, writing books is it's unusual. So I'm not sure if you wanted to answer that or you had any sort of thoughts with what drove you to write a book?
Yeah. And also to your other point, right? I feel the interesting thing about what you mentioned about the kind of thing, right, where some people might stop versus other people might say, oh, this is just, nothing I would ever be curious about. I think this is the beautiful thing, I think, and the beautiful opportunity we have as researchers to say, can I find a context that excites me, right? You will see some people who have worked on, different theories, but always in the medical sector, because they're just really, really curious about like everything that has to do with medicine. And so it's almost kind of like, I think for us, like if we can find like a context that really we're intrigued by, then even if we don't always like the theories and all these kind of things that come with it, we might as well still find it meaningful to be there. And so I think it's really, when looking at a PhD especially, and then later on, I've always looked at it as a beautiful opportunity space where you can figure out ideas, you can meet people, you can somehow in conversations with people create new knowledge. I mean, what more beautiful is there in the world? And so I think that's kind of, in a way, I think a very privileged thing that that a researcher is allowed to do, that they get time to explore those kind of mud battles and do that, and then hopefully kind of embedded with something that really carries the conversation forward. And that's the same, with a book. The initial reason I find book writing extremely interesting, especially, I mean, the way this book was structured was, and I think we briefly talked about this, right, in writing also, in terms of that I think papers are highly priced, right? So papers is the kind of currency that in a way allows you to have a career and everything else at most institutions. And then what a book allows you to do is it allows you to have a bit of an excuse to just read into all the adjacent literatures and to just kind of put all the bigger picture ideas together and perhaps kind of somehow build an identity around it one way or the other. And that's what I, by the way, completely underestimated how much then the book content itself, even if you have other papers, like becomes in a way your identity. And fortunately in this case it was what I felt was my identity, but it could have gone different. So I found it fascinating how much a book then defines you in one way or the other. But the key reason was really to say, look, there's all these different papers and all this different research we're doing, all these different stories. Can I bring this all together in one kind of bigger picture idea that hopefully then can also, be taken into curricula? It can hopefully be used by others. And so it's really about that kind of how do you scale an idea? And I feel a book is a beautiful way to scale ideas.
Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like basically your platform, right? Where you build on top of it with different things and eventually. You know who does this well? I'm not sure if you know of him, but Eric von Hippel does. He creates a series of papers and then he creates a book at the end of it. He's done that a few times. And it's nice because it sort of creates this platform to build off of. And I don't know. I think it's a really nice perspective. Hey, bud.
Hello. I can't see you, by the way. I only see.
I know. I was trying to fix that. I don't know what happened. So my son just came in.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Hi. I don't know if I'm in the.
You are. You're live.
Hi.
Hi.
I just came from.
Okay.
Go outside.
Yeah, you can. Oh, I'll be done in just a second.
Okay.
All right. Thanks. So is there anything that you wanted to share with this audience? So there's predominantly, I mean, it's everybody, and it's pretty widely oriented, but a lot of it's going to be more geared towards education, I guess. Is there anything that you want to share that we didn't cover at this moment with this audience?
Well, I think a lot of what we talked about, and I think this is also the testament to your great work that you in a way make research and the research life relatable, right? And I think it's if I think about what on the journey so far, and I'm certainly there's so much journey to go, and the thing that I enjoy the most at the moment is kind of in a way finding out who are the kind of people I truly want to have the conversation with, because if you're writing a paper, like you're entering obviously a conversation with someone, and at some point I think the more you go to conferences and the more you see also the people behind the citation, who is that actually, you also see a little bit more who's actually my people, who's the people who actually really develop those kind of ideas, and then maybe you co-author with them, and I've seen that kind of like only like several years in, like the kind of idea of who of those could also be my mentors and I could work with them, and I could, so really kind of seeing, like when we read a paper, not only seeing the content of the paper but also the people who are behind that content, and really kind of then entering a conversation with them, trying to grab a coffee with them. I mean, that's what I enjoy the most now, that kind of it makes the papers come alive, right, when you have the people behind the papers. And so I'm just a huge fan of going to those kind of conferences and things. And then the big picture, I think, from everything we talked about is really, when you think about the idea how life really unfolds, I think in our own life as researchers, there's obviously the big role of serendipity, both in terms of when we research and how we make kind of topic that we're interested in by coincidence, but also, how our career will unfold. And I think a lot of what this work tries to do is to say, how do we turn the unexpected from just being a threat to also potentially being an ally, a friend, because you can find even more interesting things in life. And so I think if there's one thing that people take from this conversation, it's hopefully that at the end of the day, we live in a world that's so ambiguous, so high uncertainty, but it doesn't always have to just be something that threatens us, but it can also be something that, in a way, when you look at people, who have had interesting careers, that are the kind of periods where they grow the most, where they find the most, and where they then end up in something really interesting. So maybe it's kind of getting back to the Viktor Frankl. There's always hope in interesting situations, especially when it feels most ambiguous.
I love that. I think that this is a great time to stop at this moment. I couldn't have said it better myself. So I apologize that I wish you could see me right now, but I'm smiling and I'm very sympathetic to what you said. And hopefully other people get to see this in the future and they resonate. Maybe they get something from it. But if you need to reach out to Kristen, I'm sure he would be very happy to chat with you. Right now, he's at the University of South Carolina. I believe he just moved, right?
University of Southern California, exactly.
California,
in Los Angeles.
The other USC.
Exactly. And so always welcome here. As you can see, it's very it is worth the trip. It's coming from New York, where everything was how it is, like there's seasons, and here it's always sunny, always warm, always nice. And so but it's an open invitation, and if there's anything I can help with, and David, we talked about, right, like how book writing, those kind of things. I'm extremely excited always to see how I can be part of other people's journeys, who are, especially when it's a journey where some people might push back on. I mean, it feels vulnerable, right, to go paths that might not be the most explored ones yet, but also I feel that kind of brings us closer together then as people who try to do that. And so it's an open invitation, and thank you so much, David, for this great platform and for connecting.
Yeah, thank you so much. If at one point you think of somebody that should be on the Reciprocity YouTube channel or whatnot, hopefully I'll try to put this in many different sources as possible. This is what I do when I'm laying in bed, when I'm ready to go to sleep. But we'll get your word out so everybody can hear about the serendipity mindset. So, but thank you so much. I appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of the day. Hopefully go to a coffee shop and spill a little bit of coffee on somebody at the coffee shop and see what happens.
Well, thanks so much, David. Have a good one.
All right. Take care. Bye.